Mineplex back out again with the release of their abysmal closed beta, which came to light just last week, on October 30th. Now, all such events leading up to this is far too long to recap in this introduction. However, it is essentially a reflection on the course of events, from the moment Mineplex initially died in the middle of 2023, to Sam buying it, and then to the gradual, disappointing, parody-like series of affairs that have led us to this moment, where we can look back on it and recount a giant list of reasons why it has been unsuccessful so far. It's also important to mention that this video is not necessarily being created out of malice. A wide variety of players are involved in the creation of this video. We come with a variety of perspectives that are virtually unrepresented in the only community that feedback has seemingly been gleaned from. We consist of Mineplex staff, former and current, builders, and a highly esteemed group of players with tens of thousands of games of experience over the entirety of the network, from its inception 11 years ago to its ultimate demise. It's important to understand this because our perspectives are obviously not that of the wider community, who are not involved with the happenings of Mineplex. We know what we are talking about as we have lived through things, and we believe that our opinions are valuable and can help drive Mineplex in the right direction. All of us have played Mineplex for a considerably long time and have been consistently active. We obviously care about the network, the brand, and the memories that we have created playing on it and creating our communities. There are hundreds of unrepresented voices out there, and although we mean to make their opinions heard, we also want to be objective with our analysis of what's happened. The fact of the matter is that we are all grown up now. The existing player base has since come to accept that the Mineplex we knew is gone, and we virtually have no reason to come back if the new product does not meet our expectations. The idea is clearly to build a new community, but that cannot happen if the product isn't good. We hope to explain why we believe the current project to be a calamity, and why we believe it isn't and won't be successful unless things change. Unfortunately, our thesis is that the project in its entirety is a failure, but that does not mean that certain things can't be changed to at least reorient the project into something that could potentially be successful. Prior to this video coming out, the team over at Mineplex have been made aware of all of the criticism here, and new avenues of communication have been established in a way that was never once done before. However, we believe that publishing this video to express the grievances of the non-vocal majority is still worthwhile, to fill the community in and to hold Mineplex accountable for its mistakes. I shouldn't have to say this, but please don't harass anyone mentioned in this video.
Like was mentioned in the introduction, Mineplex did not necessarily have one sharp decline in players and die. It was a long-winded, slow death from 6 to 7 years of absent management, as well as stagnant development and maintenance. The players who stuck around joined their own niche communities, but those too gradually withered away. We didn't think that management could have possibly been worse than what we had. By 2023, the same Christmas holiday games had been live on the server for months due to developer inactivity, and on a random day in May of the same year, the server randomly shut down and never came online again. It quickly came out that Mineplex was in multiple tens of thousands of dollars in debt to the hosting provider, showing that even the absent owner had finally abandoned his project. We accepted this fact and were prepared to move on, and the wider Minecraft community grieved the death of the previous world's most popular server. Through the hysteria, SamitoD, an old admin, bought the server to revive it. We were immediately excited because he had announced that he was distancing himself from Overwatch to instead focus exclusively on Mineplex. He announced his big plans for making the network better, including his plans for how to grow the network through his YouTube connections. He immediately joined many of the old Mineplex Discord servers to revitalize the communities and get hype going. It was a really hopeful period, and we thought that it was going to be a new, great era for the server. It has since come out that the initial plan was to simply release the server back up in its broken state and fix it quickly, giving players immediate relief. This, in hindsight, would have probably been the better course of action compared to what came afterwards. There were tens of thousands of people who were thinking about and nostalgic of Mineplex, and the vast majority of those players would have been more content if Mineplex had just stuck with its original plan and reopened the way it was, at least in the short term. Suffice to say, this did not happen. Samito immediately shut down community-spurred projects such as the highly anticipated Plexverse network, composed of ex-Mineplex staff members with popularity from the likes of various YouTubers and announcements made in the Mineplex Discord itself. This was acceptable at the time because the idea that Sam would simply re-release the server how it was before was still a likely possibility. He achieved this through a cease and desist, however, which was sharply antithetical to how he should be treating the broader community. This was essentially the first red flag that many chose to look past, nor was it the only time he would wield this power aggressively against the community. We did not hear any public announcements regarding Mineplex for several months. When an update finally came out, it was Samito talking about his ambitions to turn Mineplex into what basically equates to Minecraft Roblox. The absurdity of this idea is covered in a segment later in this video, but there's a very important part in these early months that need to be touched on. A big emphasis was initially placed on letting go of the old guard, the people responsible for failing Mineplex in the first place. Simultaneously, for no reason other than the fact that they were friends a long time ago, Samito promoted someone named AlexTheCoder, the old developer lead on old Mineplex with strong ties to the original owners, putting him in one of the most senior positions in his company. It is AlexTheCoder to be blamed for coming up with the idea of turning Mineplex into Roblox. This was done with zero consultation of anyone else, let alone the community, as we would not publicly hear about this until much later on. If Sam had at all consulted the community from the get-go, he potentially could have avoided many headaches down the road. In no particular order of severity, Alex had a long series of scandals during his time on Mineplex, both before and during his long period of chronic inactivity, that can overall be blamed for the stagnation of Mineplex development as a whole. He had a track record of making bad, rash decisions entirely by himself without the consultation of anyone else, even admins. This included unbanning hundreds of thousands of accounts at once, and releasing patches that were so unbelievably unbalanced that it threw off the server's XP economy forever, and inflated gems and treasure shards to such a degree that it became pointless to spend money on the server shop to purchase cosmetics. He somehow had an even worse track record with the community, including calling himself the Senate, while he single-handedly networked and shadow banned players for speaking out against him. He's been known to openly stat boost and use creative mode to ruin the game for other players. He's made fun of mentally unstable children in public chat. He's crashed games and throttled connection to the server for people who he didn't like. And he overall existed on a high horse where his inner circle of friends got spoiled with benefits, like exclusive cosmetics and perks that nobody else could have, at the expense of everyone else. I personally was shadow banned for around a month for speaking out against him back in 2021. If, from the start, Samito had followed his basic rule of letting go of the people responsible for the death of old Mineplex, he could have avoided the abysmal idea that was Mineplex Studios entirely. Instead, he would have to find out for himself that Alex was useless to the project, and had to fire him himself later on. This error from the immediate onset of the project sent it down a spiral.
Even with AlexTheCoder removed from the project, the idea of Mineplex Studios persisted. The basic idea of the studio model is, essentially, that Mineplex would become a platform that provided tools and hosting for the existing community to code, create, and maintain their own games. This would allow Mineplex to be self-sustaining and not require very close top-down management, because it lacks the normal maintenance that a more traditional server model requires. It sounds good on paper, but the execution of the idea has been very poor. Firstly, the idea of the product they were creating needed to be built from the ground up. Nothing like this had ever been done on Minecraft before, so they had to start from scratch. The brand name was all that Samito possessed, and had purchased seemingly without the anticipation of this type of project in mind. The business model then entails encouraging the small but loyal existing community of players who loved the Mineplex of old to come and use their, at the time, non-existent platform to build their games themselves. Immediately, this does not work, because the main product would be to sell players the ability to create their own games, and virtually 99.9% of players who played Mineplex before don't necessarily want to create any of their own, and perhaps wouldn't even know how to in the first place. Moreover, those who want to partake in the creation of a game from Mineplex Studios may not be able to deal with being responsible for maintaining it afterwards, especially when it isn't their property once it's placed on Mineplex's system. Additionally, there is no objectivity with anything. Everything was unnecessarily ambiguous and extremely confusing. Players asked a myriad of questions that simply failed to be addressed. How is it decided what games are brought back? How is it decided who's in charge of creating and maintaining games? How can it be a cohesive network if everyone can do something different? How would it at all be related to the old Mineplex that everyone around knew and loved? Why is Mineplex even making games if they are simply supposed to host them, creating a conflict of interest? How would profits be shared? Even the most invested of players in the community were unable to understand the concept. It can only be imagined how confused anyone who was not actively following the updates of the network must have felt. Resultantly, the same questions had to be asked over and over again, flooding the FAQ channel with what essentially amounts to spam and non-answers. I'd like to point out that we are still in the beta phase after well over a year in development. The beta does not look much different from the alpha, which was released in early August, nearly 3 months ago. This suggests the Mineplex Studios team is not working very efficiently. The weak and fragile structure of their server presents many persistent issues, including a failure of a queue system, hardly any games started after nearly an hour of waiting for a game, a hideously unreliable backend. The beta server went down for maintenance shortly after realizing the inability to join games was a consequence of this, and the games themselves had many present bugs and issues, such as failing to spawn with a weapon in micro battle. Yeah, I don't have a sword. Hello. We'll battle like men. Ah, that's cool, isn't it? Mineplex can be summed up in one word: unprofessional. They are part-timers. Samito expects so much from his team, delegating every possible task so he can focus on his competitive Overwatch career. After a series of failure to keep promises and lack of disclosure as to what's happening behind the scenes, the team continued to turn heads away from the project they're supposed to be so passionate about. Samito, if you truly desire the best for everyone on your team and for your global audience of soon-to-be consumers, you need to work it out fast, or I'm afraid it will be too late. Just to add insult to injury, of the few studios who were permitted to work within their system as it was being created, several refused to even use the Mineplex SDK that they had spent so long developing because it was simply dysfunctional and unreliable. This only resulted in an even greater deviation from network cohesion because each studio did their own entirely different thing with entirely different systems. And even still, had the studio idea worked out the way that they were anticipating, it would have been extremely arbitrary and confusing for anyone who wants to play their old favourite games. The entire idea of using the established Mineplex brand, which was well known across the Minecraft multiplayer scene that held it to a certain degree of fun and quality, to promote a mess of loosely related, non-cohesive games that varied a ton in quality, is absolutely a surefire way to tarnish whatever positive thoughts were left of the brand. Mineplex used to be known for its innovation and simplicity, but also its quality and cohesion. Promoting watered-down, badly made games does way more harm to the brand's legacy than good. All this has resulted in tired, overworked studio creators working solely out of passion with zero pay for their efforts, a project that is still in shambles a year and a half after being started, a community that is long gone after waiting for so long for nothing, and a remaining community a fraction of the size that it could have been, feeling extremely disappointed with the few bits of progress that they have been let in on once every several months.
A unique facet of the situation that we personally believe to be the largest reason for this project failing is Samito's involvement. Like we had mentioned before, we initially thought that he would be the perfect fit because he initially came off as exactly the opposite of how old Mineplex leadership had functioned. He was active, engaged with the community for feedback, was ambitious, and had a fiery charisma that was extremely beneficial to giving the server some identity. However, we failed to realize the true depth of how argumentative, stubborn, and problematic he would otherwise prove to be in the year and a half that followed his acquisition of Mineplex. Very early on, Samito stopped disclosing updates to the community. He originally quit Overwatch to focus on this new Mineplex endeavor, but once he realized that this studio idea was what they were going to roll with, his focus seemed to shift back to Overwatch. It's understandable since he has a career in Overwatch, but from the perspective of everyone in the community, he seemingly put Overwatch above Mineplex. Sam has gone months without even tweeting anything Mineplex related to the excited community who were waiting in anticipation. He became the Overwatch 6v6 guy and not the Mineplex guy. Obviously, we now know that this is because of complications that introducing the idea of the studio model has caused, but it is still no excuse. His hubris and refusal to admit when he was wrong, even after firing the man responsible for the bad idea, is solely responsible for the community being so confused and holding out hope for so long on a project that keeps on being delayed. Samito very quickly stopped looking at the old Mineplex Game Insights Discord for, well, the insight which he had initially joined for. He had also joined the Level 100 Discord to speak with the top players from Mineplex, who had ample experience putting up with the old Mineplex despite its issues. This was obviously to engage the more knowledgeable and experienced community members to discuss how things should be, getting a wide variety of opinions to maintain the good parts of Mineplex while advising on ways to make it better. Unfortunately, after a short period of time taking minimal feedback, he decided instead of utilizing the Discord servers full of valuable insight for him to use, he'd rather have a public meltdown in the general chat of the level 100 Discord. He made a big deal out of the fact that he was leaving and not coming back. He then took to DMs to try to pry the usernames of the players who made him mad. The reason he got mad at these players is literally because they called him a noob. What he fails to realize is that a good amount of the players in there had just moved on from Mineplex and just wanted to troll. He was only shooting himself in the foot for not being more receptive to the feedback of the most active and knowledgeable player base who still cared enough to entertain the idea of playing on a revived Mineplex. He claims that he wants feedback, but from the outside, it seems like he would rather listen to those who do not challenge him or disagree with him on his opinions. The studio partners, who have collectively poured hundreds of hours into developing their respective games with zero pay besides the passion that drives them, have agreed that Sam does not respect them or the time that they have dedicated to making his product for him. He rarely acknowledges the studios actually developing the games responsible for a large majority of the content offered by Mineplex. It should be fair to note that Mineplex undertook the development of Cake Wars, but it was one of the worst performing, worst received games on the first closed alpha. The developers were essentially doing free labor for him. Sam would say to their faces that they are not as important as they truly are. He lied about having a plan that would make the model cohesive and incentivize studios to work together. He dictated how things are supposed to be done by making non-negotiable, executive creative decisions among a myriad of other things. Telling the passion-driven volunteers building your entire product for you that studios are not Mineplex in its entirety, not even close, is a slap in the face for all the hard work that they put in. You definitely cannot expect them to remain motivated to work for you for free when you refuse to even concede the obvious fact that Mineplex would have nothing to show for after a year and a half without the dedication exhibited by the studios working on their passion projects. It's truly shameful, and I would ask that Samito, if he has not already, privately reach out to those who he insulted and apologize. From the perspective of the entire outside community, Sam clearly does not consider this project important to him anymore. In every single Mineplex announcement video, he has had Overwatch playing in the background rather than anything regarding the product he's asking people to support. He falsely promised a holiday 2023 closed alpha, selling passes for upwards of $100, with a false promise to his players that there would be a playable alpha for them if they supported the network. In actuality, by December 1st, only one game that was expected to be ready was even functional on an alpha release. Samito is too proud to admit that he severely underestimated what this project would entail, and he performed what some would consider to be a gigantic scam, effectively convincing hundreds of players, including us, to buy a product based on these false promises. The project overall just seems like it would benefit greatly if Samito were to remove himself beyond an investor role and onboard more qualified people who could effectively communicate with the players, be receptive to feedback, and be appreciative to the developers who are creating all of the content the network will launch with. Overall, just be real to the people who have waited a year and a half for things to happen. It's not unexpected that delays occur, but it would be more effective if things were just properly transparent like they were promised to be. And in all fairness, Samito has since brought on a community manager and PR representative to speak on behalf of him. Whether or not things actually change as a result of this hinges entirely on how Samito utilizes them, but it's definitely a step in the right direction to amend the rift between Mineplex leadership and the community.
After a year and a half of anticipation, the alpha finally released on the 9th of August. From the beginning, the narrative was that it was simply an infrastructure test, meaning many issues in the games themselves were meant to be overlooked, as it was not the focus of the playtest. Players who understood that fact seemed to be fairly receptive to it. Although the lack of cohesion between games, paired with a lot of the evident gameplay issues, the server's problems were very apparent and left a sour taste in people's mouths. We had waited for well over a year to get any sort of product, only for it to resemble a poorly performing infrastructure test, featuring games that were often well below the expectations of many players, especially considering how long they had waited for them to come out. Several months after this, much to the surprise of several studio developers, another alpha was announced to happen at some point in the near future. Alarm bells internally rang, as engineers who knew of the infrastructure status concurred that the queue system was not functioning. Despite this, nothing changed prior to release. The playtest was teased and announced with very short notice, but released to a larger influx of players compared to the previous test. With more players on a worse performing network, the queue system completely broke. This is not necessarily surprising, but the fact that it worked so unsuccessfully was in large part due to the known internal issues that had not been addressed. Everything about the release felt rushed. Little to no changes had been made to many of the games, seemingly due to internal inactivity, but also likely in large part due to the expected drop in motivation to work so hard while unpaid for someone who clearly did not value it. Although every game can be nitpicked, it's more important to us to point out the failures of the games that Mineplex themselves developed. A small side note is that clans had pay-to-win functionality that broke the EULA forced down mid by Samito. This has since been reported to Mojang and is a relatively minor mistake that is thankfully simple to revert. The larger issue to point out is the release of a revamp of the well-known successful Halloween horror event game. The legacy of this holiday game stretches back over 10 years on old Mineplex. Each iteration of the game on the old network had built off of its predecessors, often changing year by year to best appeal to players based on feedback and polishing replayability, resulting in the best version of itself to be landed on in the form of Halloween Havoc in the late 2010s. For some odd reason, they entirely ditched what made the game not only fun, but also nostalgic, in place for a hollow replacement where clearly the only real bit of effort that was put into it was the map. It was extremely slow, had distracting abilities that impaired vision, had several pre-produced models that were not created by Mineplex, and did not progress through a storyline. It's unknown how this game was created, but even the Halloween horror on Mineplex over 10 years ago had clear story progression, proper pacing, and a worthwhile reward. This can easily be attributed to Samito's lack of knowledge on what makes Halloween games so compelling in the first place, as well as the rush to push out a product regardless of how unfinished or unpolished it was. The hope is that things can change to properly address the creation of a Christmas holiday game if it is to eventually publish one.
I'm gonna go off script here with a few thoughts of my own. I did the Halloween Horror, the new version from Mineplex, just the other day. What I fell in love with originally on old Mineplex was a game that was surprisingly streamlined and had a very, very compelling storyline that was also PvE. There are not very many good PvE experiences in general, and I found it very, very interesting that Mineplex, of all places, was able to make one that I came back to year after year and grinded almost like it was a second job. That really spoke to me. So when I heard that they were announcing Halloween Havoc, or rather Halloween Horror, as a return mode for this server, I got really excited. Unfortunately, what I ended up playing was an extremely rudimentary asset flip that they didn't really seem to put much effort into. The map itself was nice, but not big and certainly not streamlined like other modes have been in the past, and I genuinely think that the VFX and abilities were more annoying than anything. When it comes to old Halloween Havoc, you had kits that boosted mobility, you had ones that enabled speedrunning, you had ones that enabled you to do well in the more difficult modes. There was so much depth to it, a surprising amount of depth. And all of that depth has been stripped away in what feels like an attempt to simply show off a ton of assets that they didn't make in a sort of botched, put together really fast type of way. And I understand wanting to get a product out there, but I think that this could have been in the oven for way longer and released next Halloween, or I think that they could have put so much more effort into revamping the old Halloween Havoc that we all know and love, and I would have enjoyed it so much more. But those are just my thoughts, and back to the video.
It's also imperative to mention that with the release of the closed beta, Samito utilized his leverage to shut down another community-run project with seemingly no reason other than the fact that he perceived it as competition. After the initial shutdown of Mineplex, hundreds of players wanted a revival for the leagues that were dedicated to playing certain Mineplex games in a competitive manner. The Cake Wars Competitive League, Champions Competitive League, and for a time the Bridges Competitive League were being run actively on a daily basis on unmonetized bootleg servers as a way of enjoying their respective favorite games that they can no longer expect to play on the real Mineplex. CWCL had thousands of games played over the past few months alone, and CCL is currently on their 18th competitive season with 9 actively participating teams. With the release of beta, these copycat servers were forcibly shut down, and hundreds of players are now unable to play anymore. The cake wars on the beta is a slap in the face to all of these players. It was not in a state that satisfies the competitive scene, including the fact that private servers do not exist, the combat being custom and poorly replicating 1.8, and certain gameplay features being buggy or missing. Speaking of missing, both champions and bridges had no spot in either the alpha or the beta, and it is unknown when or even if they will be added in the future. Attempts are currently being made to rebuild these game modes from scratch, thanks to volunteer developers from the competitive community, but it is unclear how much these modes will differ from their originals. It's still just a huge disappointment for the hundreds of people who have been completely abandoned by Samito, and it would be really great to see an effort to rectify the fate of these communities. All in all, we firmly believe that this studio model was doomed to fail to begin with. The team from the get-go, as well as trying to maintain the community and hype for this long, was unsustainable. We want to reiterate that we all love what Mineplex has meant to us throughout the years, and we only want it to succeed. It's very upsetting to even feel compelled to make this video at all. We believe it is the only way to make our voices heard and potentially incite some change. Otherwise, the project will almost certainly fail. The studio model, as contradictory to what made Mineplex so popular back then, and as bad as we believe it to be, could truly work, so long as there is proper balance, maintenance, communication, and trust. We all have zero reason to engage in this project if we feel bored, disrespected, scammed, or just downright disappointed. Again, we want to repeat that we are not making this video with any ill intent. We all love Mineplex, and we would not have invested the time and effort into making this video if we didn't. Like we mentioned before, Mineplex has already begun to take steps to address some of the issues covered in this video. Our thesis is fundamentally that the project in its current form is a failure, and we do not necessarily intend to incite change on the basis of feedback in this video alone. Our intention was to inform people who potentially were unaware of what's happened so far about why Mineplex is in the position that it's in, and to hopefully spur Mineplex leadership into taking steps to revive their project. Samito, like you said the moment you bought it, we're in this to win this. Hopefully, for the sake of the brand, things change. Otherwise, it'll be another sad, quiet death like it was the first time for the server we all know and love. Thank you for watching.